Professor Charles Mills.
Thanks, guys. So, I'm both delighted and saddened to be at this conference honoring Larry Blum. Happy to be here in recognition of his numerous achievements and many contributions to the profession. Sorry to see him go. Though I'm sure I'm not alone in expressing my hope that he will continue to be active in publishing in the field, considering how much I and all of us have learned from his work over the years. Now, Larry, this just came up, Larry was originally one of the very few white philosophers who made race a regular part of his research, thereby assisting the long process of legitimizing this research agenda in the discipline. I don't have to tell anybody in this audience how white the profession continues to be. In 1995, nearly a quarter century ago, Leonard Harris complained in a famous letter to the APA Proceedings and Addresses that American philosophy was so racially exclusionary that it could well have been created by the Ku Klux Klan. Today, there's far more self-consciousness in official circles about the need to diversify the demography, with numerous active lobbying and support groups and regular APA panels on the topic. But it's noteworthy that even today, with a far greater degree of visibility of black philosophers, for example, and 4 black APA presidents since Harris wrote, it is still the case that blacks comprise no more than 1% of the profession, the same percentage as when Harris composed his original letter. Nonetheless, through the efforts of Harris and other pioneering African American figures, some retired, some on the verge of retirement, like Lucius Outlaw, Bill Lawson, Bernard Boxill, Howard McGarry, and others, Africana philosophy and critical philosophy of race are far better established and significantly less marginal than they used to be. And Larry's writings on race constitute an invaluable contribution in having helped to make this happen. In a contemporary vocabulary, he has been a crucial white ally. Now, the virtues of his work are too manifold to be recounted in full detail here. But standouts for me are, to begin with, the clarity, a classic ideal for the analytic tradition that is, however, not always put to the most worthy ends. In a famous dismissive line about analytic philosophy, an unhappily high percentage of this work is characterized by points without distinction and distinctions without point. A great line. I'm not sure who came up with it originally. In Larry's writings, by contrast, you know that the patient teasing apart of what has been confused or unwittingly conflated is going to have a significant conceptual payoff further down the line. These are distinctions that do make a difference. Then, relatedly, there's a carefulness and thoughtfulness, not as timidity and a refusal to take a stand, but as a determination to work in one's way past irrelevances to the philosophical heart of the matter. And finally, of course, in a discipline too often woefully delinquent in living up to its proclaimed goals of seeking truth and justice, Larry's transparent commitment luminously infusing all his work to the struggle for a better society. If the ideals of 60s, 70s radicalism were replaced for all too many of that generation by careerist self-seeking, in Larry Blum, they have remained steadfastly alive and well, orienting both his more abstract and his more applied philosophical work. Let me turn now to one of his more specific, guiding methodological assumptions that is particularly congenial to me: his linking of the individual and the social. In the classic political economy of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was taken for granted that individual psychology should be socially contextualized. Thus, it was not remarkable that Adam Smith should write both The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But even at its best, of course, the picture of society offered by mainstream political theorists and philosophers was a deeply idealized one, shaped by their class, gender, and racial privilege. as Ann Codd pointed out years ago in her book Analyzing Oppression, a discipline supposedly having as its main aim the understanding and amelioration of the human condition has had surprisingly little to say about the actual oppressive conditions that have afflicted most humans. And the legacy of this history of evasion persists, of course, in the formal prioritization of ideal theory in political philosophy over the past half-century because of the huge influence of John Rawls's work. So in the analytic political mainstream, individuals are conceived of either in an abstract, desocialized way, or when the social is permitted entry, in a fashion that abstracts away from the realities of social privilege and subordination. In Blum, by contrast, there's a keen sense, a felt imperative of the importance of relating the formation of moral psychology to oppressive environing structures. Thus, in his treatment of race, we find a self-conscious contextualization of individual psychodynamics in larger societal framings. Room for moral agency and corresponding moral responsibility is always recognized and insisted upon. It is certainly not a matter of a crude social fatalism, but the shaping of options objectively by material circumstances and our perception of these options subjectively by the shaping of dominant cognitive norms is likewise acknowledged. The example I'm going to use here is his contribution to the South African Journal of Philosophy's symposium on South African philosopher Samantha Weiss's well-known article, How Can I Live in This Strange Place? An article that ignited a great controversy, not just in the South African Academy, but highly unusually for an academic essay in the broader public sphere. There were even pieces in South African newspapers. Weiss had argued that given the deep imbrication of white South African life worlds with the enduring structures of white privilege, even in a supposedly post-apartheid South Africa, it was impossible for whites to lead virtuous lives. Thus, the only appropriate response to the shame they should feel, even if they often didn't, was a disengagement from civic activity and a withdrawal into private life. Though her own focus was her native land, the issue of the appropriate moral and political choices for those illicitly advantaged by oppressive systems is obviously a very general one. So the defensibility or not of her position has ramifications that are much broader. Of course, Western philosophy has, in a sense, been discussing the norms for being virtuous since its classical origins. And in Rawls, we are supposed to have a general obligation to maintain, or help bring about, if it doesn't yet exist, a just society. But as noted, the ideal theoretic orientation of this body of work marginalizes the circumstances of actual oppressive societies in general, and certainly of racist societies in particular. So the real-life moral and political challenges posed by negotiating one's whiteness in a white-dominant society have not at all, to say the least, been central to mainstream philosophical discussions of justice. Rather, it is academic work in other disciplines or popular explorations of the topic in the writings of white anti-racist activists that has taken the lead on this crucial issue. Weiss had demarcated three key dimensions of the typical white situation: positional advantage in the form of unjust material and social benefits, problematic patterns of perception and cognition, and dominant behavioral patterns. So all three will tend to be contaminated by race and racism, whether conscious or unconscious. In reply, Blum differentiates two possible kinds of response, not necessarily mutually exclusive. The individual, that is personal self-monitoring and aspirational self-transformation, and the civic, that is political engagement. He sees Weiss as basically opting for the first and deprecating by comparison the potential of the latter. Yet whether as a white ally in solidarity with black struggles or as an active battler for racial justice, whites do have options that will not only positively advance the struggle for a more just society, but are likely to contribute to that very transformation of moral psychology that the individual approach has made most salient. Rather than a solitary exercise in willed self-reform, a moral bootstrapping from the isolation of one's private and self-cultivated garden, one would be in a collective solidaristic alliance with other progressives, probably not only one's fellow whites, but people of color also, and thus not merely more likely to be effective in actually bringing about social change, but being able to benefit from the friendly, and perhaps sometimes not so friendly criticisms of those people of color whose external perspective on one's whiteliness may be far better informed than one's attempt to try to reconstruct it from within. So ironically, the personal transformation sought may be better accomplished by indirect than seemingly direct means. Now, though the situation of post-apartheid South Africa and a nominally post-civil rights United States are very different, Blum's intervention obviously has broader ramifications for how we should approach the issue of white moral responsibility in the face of enduring racial inequity. Moreover, a welcome development over the last few years, partly as a result of the activism of Black Lives Matter, partly as a result of alarm over the resurgence of racism and white nationalism accompanying Donald Trump's campaign and now 2+ year presidency, has been the renewed respectability of racial justice as a term. The post-racial delusions engendered by Barack Obama's 2008 election have long since been dispelled, except for the most determined manufacturers of their own facts, of which, of course, there are still quite a few. With the Democratic Party's remarkable shift to the left after Sanders' 2016 challenge, we are headed into an electoral campaign in which several mainstream Democratic candidates have actually made racial justice a central plank of their platform. Think how bizarre that is, to say that racial justice should be an issue of concern when you're deciding on who to elect as President of the United States. It's just so weird. More than has been the case for many decades then, the practical question posed years ago by Linda Martin Alcoff, what should white people do, has become pressingly salient, and with it a growing willingness on the part of young white Americans in particular to heed the recommendations of people of color. So if ever a time was propitious for a national debate on how racial justice should be understood, by what norms and principles it should be determined, and what the differential responsibilities of whites and people of color are to help bring it about, that time is now. If philosophy has been largely absent from these discussions in the past, all the more reason to remedy that historic neglect by making up for past silence now. You can understand then why I am torn between celebrating Larry Blum's achievements in this subject area and mourning his departure. Though, as I said at the start, we hold out the hope that he will continue to publish. The brief 15 minutes allocated to us obviously precluded any more detailed assessment and appreciation of the worth of his work. But in the single article I have looked at, you can see how relevant his critique and prescriptions are for a present moment. The line of argument he has developed for white moral and political responsibilities in South Africa can certainly be transferred, suitably modified to the United States. Whereas whites are a small, if still economically powerful minority there, here they still constitute the majority, if a dwindling one, and are hegemonic across multiple social and political spheres. So the challenge of mobilizing at least a significant fraction of the white population for racial justice needs to be on the front burner. Larry Blum's work provides invaluable insights for us on so many of the issues raised by this challenge. The metaphysics of race, how we should think of racism and differentiate it from neighboring mental attitudes, the appropriate perspective on what has come to be called white privilege, and many others. He has left us a body of work, both a great contribution in itself and a solid foundation to be built upon by what one hopes will be a new generation of young philosophers more woke to the central reality of the United States than their sleeping or affectedly ignorant elders. Thank you, Larry. If only we had more white guys like you.
It's just fantastic for me to be on the same bill, so to speak, with Charles Mills. Students of mine who took my racism class know who Charles Mills is. I'm sure many others of you do as well, but he's, you know, the kind of premier race scholar of our time.
I'll pay you later, Larry.
I just wanted to say, by the way, that I have retired from teaching at UMass, but I'm in no way retired from, as it were, life, which for me includes scholarship
Wonderful.
and engagement. No, it's the next stage. I just had to give up the teaching after the 45 years. But anyway, I haven't completely given up the teaching, and I don't want to, but I've 90% given up. So I was very interested in your read of the contemporary situation, and I basically agree that on the one hand, these incredibly horrible things are happening, and on the other hand, partly because those horrible things are happening, there are a much larger group of people, you know, people of color have just gotten mobilized politically in kind of astounding ways, as you mentioned, and I do agree that while it's definitely a minority of white people, many more white people sort of think that racial justice is a concern. I think it's partly because of the Black Lives Matter movement and partly because of the police killings that movement was an initial response to, but also the rise of Trump and republicanism, the republicanism of our moment. And I do hope that philosophy has some role to play in this the wokeness of white people. And you know, Sally, my friend and colleague here, Sally Haslanger, and other people are involved in sort of bringing philosophy kind of out to the world more, and that's been one of the responses to this, to this imperative of our time to sort of engage with things that are going on. My colleague Meira does an ethics center here that also is kind of engaged in some race-related projects from that center. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic, both about the progressive movement of our time and of some role that philosophers can play. So I'm not sure. I guess I just wanted to say about the Samantha Weiss article. It's really a remarkable article, and after I wrote that article, several years later, I was invited to teach in Samantha Weiss's department, so I got to know her sort of as a friend, and it's an article that's a cry of anguish of a white person who is so trying to deal with the incredible injustice of that particular society of South Africa. But I think that she ends up just going off the rails in where she wants to go with that anguish. And I tried to honor both the anguish and the sincerity and the integrity of her attempt in that article. It's really an amazing article, and she's a kind of Iris Murdochian, so that's something that I had in common with her. But yeah, so that's all.
Hi, can you all hear me? So a question, I guess, for both of you. Professor Mills, you had talked a little bit about ideal theory and how that doesn't sort of cut it when it comes to issues of race and maybe political philosophy in general. And I'm wondering, since there are still a lot of philosophers doing that, what role do you think that ideal theory sort of models can play in addressing these issues of racial justice that we're now facing?
Okay, so a confusion that still has to be addressed is the equating of ideal theory with normative theory. So people sometimes interpret you as meaning we need to abandon normative theory. I'm not saying that for a second. It needs to be recalled that ideal theory is just one kind of normative theory. It's a normative theory of a perfectly just society. And even under that category, they're sort of different versions. And there have been various survey articles pointing out the sort of ambiguities. So my target is specifically the brand of ideal theory as developed by Rawls and his disciples. The problem with it is that by its very nature, it ignores historical injustice. Race is largely a matter of historical injustice and correcting historical injustice. Rawls has 5 books. If you exclude the 2 essay collections, they cumulatively add up to more than 2,000 pages. Nowhere in these 2,000 pages is a matter of corrective justice discussed. And it's not that his disciples have remedied this neglect, rather they have followed up on it and maintained it. So you have a vast body of literature dealing with social justice into the central injustice on which this country was founded, racial injustice, which is not just slavery. You find the line here, President Obama's original sin. The original sin is expropriation and genocide of Native Americans. That's the original sin. So there's that and slavery. Racial subordination, racial injustice, central to the foundation of the United States. If you are a serious American political philosopher and you claim that you're dealing with social justice, then for God's sake, you need to talk about racial justice. So for me, it's another manifestation of what I mentioned at the start as the demographic wideness of the profession and how it has oriented the concepts and the theory. It has enlarged the people of color. I've raised this with a few white progressives like Larry. There's a guy that people may not know, a graduate from CUNY actually many years ago, David Theo Goldberg, South African guy, graduated way back in the 80s. David became so fed up with philosophy, he basically just exited. So he's very active. He's known globally as a race theorist, but he doesn't move in philosophy circles. So we need to ask ourselves, how has social justice as a concept developed in such a deformed fashion that has become utterly separate from the social justice questions being raised by people in the street, by Black Lives Matter and others? And my claim would be that it's a combination of the demography, the overwhelming white maleness of the profession, and a history that goes back to antiquity. And I have a former colleague, Samuel Fleischacker, when I was at the University of Illinois. It's a very interesting book, A Short History of Distributive Justice. And in that book, he makes a startling point. It was a revelation to me. I'm not a history of philosophy guy. That the concept we think of as dating back to Aristotle, the concept that Rawls invokes, is a concept no more recent than the 1790s. And Fleischhacker's claim is that in Aristotle, distributive justice is not something we're entitled to merely by virtue of being human. It's tied to social status. It's tied to privilege. So it's really only 2,000 years later in the French Revolution, in the writings of a guy called Boeuf, that you then get a theory of social justice, or a committed principle of social justice, delinked from social status. And to me, that's an indictment of the demographic base of the profession, stretching back to male domination, upper class domination, then by sort of modern period racial domination. So that philosophy, who we're supposed to be the justice guys, supposed to have the franchise, philosophy has been part of the problem. And that's why the discussions of social justice in philosophy circles have been historically so delinquent. Large measure, in my opinion, because of the demographic base. So once you recognize that, it means that you don't sort of start from the perspective that there's sort of some presumptive the presumption is in favor of these inherited concepts. We sort of work with them and see what we can do with them. The presumption is the opposite. It's against them, given the sort of long history of conceptual and normative malfeasance that you find manifested in the social justice literature of the Western tradition, going back 2,500 years.
I think we might need to keep moving if that's okay. Larry, do you want to say something?
Well, I was going to ask Charles sort of a larger question, but
yeah. Think how long I went on just for that question. We've got to think of the next panelist.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say it and then we. So I completely agree with Charles that the absence of reparative justice is this incredible gap in the tradition. But in terms of your own recent attempts, or more like, it's more like a promissory note. Your articles that are starting to come up with a conception of reparative justice, reparative justice is still a type of justice. And so in your new work, you are drawing on some concepts from the same tradition that has been so problematic. And I don't know, so that I just wanted to hear more about that.
More white guys like Lara Blum, ladies and gentlemen.
Professor Meira Levinson.
All right. So I am really, really, really grateful to Chris and Larry for inviting me to do this, and to Larry for being the person that he is. So the title of this session, at least officially on the poster, is Race Studies, Education, and Philosophical Method in Larry Blum's Work. And I think I'm supposed to talk about the middle piece of that, which is the education piece. But of course, it's totally wrapped in with the race studies and the philosophical method. And frankly, it's also wrapped in Larry Blum, right? And Larry Blum's work being part of it. So I want to really start actually before, I'm going to sort of talk about Larry as an education scholar, but I want to start just by saying that Larry's a mensch. And a mentor to, I think, many, many of us in this room, either directly, because he mentored us directly as he did me. So I don't know if this was the first time I met Larry, but it was the first time I engaged with him as a mentor was when I was at Cornell. They have this, young scholars thing. And Larry was one of the two, senior scholars commenting on my young scholarship. And I was supposed to get in paper, I don't know, in early December, and my daughter was born in early December, and so that didn't happen. And then it didn't come in late December. And finally, in early January, Larry said, I need some time to think about what you have to say. So if there's any way you could get this to me, because otherwise I can't think, I need time to think. And so I madly, banged out something finally one night when Rebecca managed to sleep for 6 hours. But Larry, when we got together at Cornell, and he gave me comments on that chapter, which eventually became a chapter of one of my books, I came to understand what Larry meant about needing to think about it, because he thinks about what you write and what you say very, very deeply. This was not a couple of, notes scribbled on the back of a napkin, that's covered with Delta pretzels or something, where he read it on the airplane. This is just deeply thought out work and responses and deeply thought out mentorship, where he guides over time. We had lunches at High Rise for some years on Brattle Street until it closed. He's introduced me to those who he has mentored, like Chris Lewis, who's here, whose work then I got to know and admire over the years. And I see sort of things, it's fascinating. 3 of my students, one of my students is here in the audience, 2 others of my students, Jacob Fay and Tatiana Giron, both said, I so wish I could be here. And I thought, wait, how do you even have these relationships with them? Larry just pulls people in and embraces them in the profession and in the work of being a good human being, which I think is a lot what his work is about. So I just wanted to appreciate that. And in some ways, I think that actually characterizes Larry's work in education. I was thinking about Larry's work as a philosopher of education, and then I realized, and this is actually I don't know if this counts as a philosophical insight, but it's sort of a conceptual insight of my own, that actually Larry is, he is a philosopher of education, but really what I want to do is talk about him as an educational philosopher. And that's a construction that I've never really quite thought through before. But as I was rereading his work, and especially rereading his book on high schools, Race in America's Future, it came to me that what Larry does as an educational philosopher is, say, 3 things. He philosophizes about education. He philosophizes through education. And then he philosophizes as education. And those are related, but also somewhat different. So I want to talk a little bit through each of those, a little bit meaning, 3 minutes each or something, right? Since I have 15 minutes total, and I probably used up 5 already. And then I want to draw a couple of lessons for work, sort of in his spirit of mentorship, and thinking about sort of channeling what lessons I think he's taught me and some of the rest of us in the room, and that we might take further. So first, when I was looking at Larry's work and trying to decide what among the humongous corpus that Larry has written in philosophy of education over the last few decades, I was going to reread and or read, because there's no way I've read all of it. I was really struck about the number of different kinds of things he has philosophized about education. So he's philosophized about charter schools. He wrote a really beautiful commentary in a book that I co-edited about thinking about charter schools and markets and democracy. He's philosophized about affirmative action, Holocaust studies, race, obviously, moral education, where he has had, I think, I don't know if anybody's going to talk about this, but his role in the Association of Moral Education, AME, has been, I think, equally just profound, and I don't know if it's grandfather-like, maybe that's Larry Kohlberg, maybe it's father-like, I'm not sure where sort of he is in the generations, but the role in AME has been also really kind of all-encompassing. So moral education, film, I know, and then thinking about multicultural and intercultural education, diversity, equality in the context of education. It's just a lot of different topics in education that he has thought about. But that's true, I think, of a lot of people who are philosophers of education. What's interesting to me in thinking about Larry's work as an educational philosopher is that not only does he philosophize about these different things in education, which I would really recommend that you read, because many of them are there. Actually, everything I reread or read for the first time was really good. And I thought, oh, right. Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. But he also philosophizes through education, which is far more distinctive and which partly then helps to make his philosophizing about education just much more interesting and insightful, I think, than often is true for philosophers of education. So he philosophizes through education by philosophizing through and about his teaching, here at UMass Boston, and also I think, say, in his book on high schools, Race in America's Future, most directly and openly, explicitly, in the class that he taught for 4 years on race and racism at Cambridge Fringe and Latin School, and which is what we had many conversations about while sitting at High Rise over those years. There's a bunch of things that Larry does in philosophizing through education and through his work, but the thing I'll use my 2 minutes on this to bring out is that he sees the process of educating as itself educative, that he learns and hence we learn from looking at the process of education in a really, really deep way. Education is often a backwater in philosophy. It's a really low status. It's low status people, mostly women, who are working with even more low status people, children, and in this country, in fact, now a majority working with children of color. And so, the whole thing is just this low status backwater. And what Larry does is really insistently, quietly, because he's Larry, really humbly and not not in any kind of haranguing or hectoring way, but super insistently, he shows us how and why attending to how we can and should educate others educates ourselves as to how we can and should develop and be in the world. So one example of this is that he talks at a few times in this book on his high school teaching about stereotypes. His first chapter opens with one of the opening classes of that class that he taught at CRLS, where he asks students to pair up and introduce themselves to each other, name how they identify racially, and one, I think, negative stereotype. I think you specify negative stereotype.
Stereotype that they don't like.
Right, that they don't like, right. A stereotype that they don't like about their own racial group. And then the kids introduce each other to the class as a whole. This is X, he identifies as half black, half white, and one stereotype he doesn't like is, Y. And then Larry very, very uncarefully unpacks why does he do this very early. And he has a whole bunch of really interesting reasons about the ways in which we kind of demystify talking about stereotypes. You can't take a class on race and racism and not be willing to talk about these things. But how do you talk about them when you're afraid of offending others, when you don't know what is appropriate, et cetera? So he talks sort of about that pedagogically, but also he unpacks a bunch of the stereotypes themselves. He starts doing philosophical work, talking about different sort of categories of stereotype and why they are inappropriate, why people see them as inappropriate in very different ways, right? And then he thinks about the risks of talking about stereotypes in such a way as to reinforce those stereotypes versus as a way to debunk them. So later on in the book, he has a whole chapter, for example, about the stereotype of black intellectual inferiority. And he goes in beautiful detail into conversations among the kids and himself about the way that the evil, horrific myth of black intellectual inferiority was constructed over time historically, how it plays out culturally, intellectually, and then in people's lives, and tries to make sense of how it may be playing out, in fact, in his own students' lives, and his worry that in even deconstructing this myth, there is this risk of reinforcing the idea that it may have some validity, and so he offers really, really careful instructions to teachers, whom part of whom he's writing this book for, to say, do not treat this as a controversial issue, right? We cannot treat black intellectual inferiority as something that we're going to debate the pro and cons of, right? That is wrong. We have to treat this as an entirely malign, appropriately debunked stereotype, yet think together about how does that get constructed? What does it teach us about race and racism? What does it teach us about the cultural firmament that we live in? What does it teach us about our own roles as teachers in trying to promote broader ideals, including of diversity, solidarity, and equality? And it's just beautifully, beautifully done. And Larry does that with all sorts of concepts and ideas. And in that respect, this is what leads us to his third role as an educational philosopher, which is that he philosophizes as education. One of the things that's really great about Larry's work, and I think it really comes to full fruition in this book on high schools, is that he positions himself as a teacher talking to other teachers. And he's doing philosophy and history along the way. But he's very intentional in how much philosophy and history he teaches the teachers he's talking to, right? There is no shying away from the fact, as I'm reading this, thinking, wow, you've managed to pack a lot in here that you expect that the teachers who are reading this aren't going to know, and that they need to know if they are going to take you up on your invitation to have a serious scholarly inquiry into race and racism with their own students in their own high schools or middle schools or, frankly, even universities. But he does so in a way that is entirely as a colleague, right? So he has really careful pedagogical work going on in the book, bringing in ideas and introducing people to references and, you know, readings and concepts and so forth that they might not be familiar with, drawing distinctions, but in a way that's kind of wrapping his arm around others, saying, oh, great, you know, I'm a teacher, you're a teacher, let's sort of chat about this, and I'll talk about times I was unsure, etc., which is really, really, really beautifully done. And in doing that, he invites teachers themselves to adopt a philosophical process and mindset, and he demystifies it. He demystifies the practice of doing philosophy and suggests, I think, that we can all engage in philosophy so long as we are willing to think really, really carefully and not be satisfied with our own presuppositions or our own first thoughts, and that we have to be kind of fearless, right? Because that's part of what Larry models in his work, is an intellectual fearlessness to keep on pushing, including through things that for others I think they would shy away from because they would worry that they were being seen as being offensive or crude or all sorts of things. So there's like this wonderful whole chapter about stiff-hipped white couple at a Latino-themed dance, and like, you know, whether it was appropriate for the kids to make fun of these white kids at this dance, and ends up in this beautiful discussion about sort of solidaristic spaces and sort of racially identified or ethnically identified spaces, about power relationships, about questions about symmetry, when is ethical symmetry or moral symmetry appropriate and not, all sorts of really, really, really important philosophical concepts done through this really hilarious example, like just tiny, tiny, tiny example about this, you know, pair of white kids as stiff-hip dancers. And in doing that, he, I think, really does a great job of inviting teachers to say, you know, you all like try to unpack what goes on, right? One of the things that teachers do really consistently is they talk with others and they're like, oh my gosh, can I talk to you about what happened in my class? And they start to try to take it apart. And Larry's doing that too, and he's taking it apart. Really, really sophisticated ways, but it makes us all think, oh, well, maybe we could do that too. So my last couple minutes, I want to talk about what lessons I sort of take from Larry's work in sort of philosophizing about education, through education, and as education, sort of learning from it, that I sort of want to apply in my own work, and I hope that maybe some of you will do the same with. So first of all, Larry learns from others outside philosophy, right? We've heard already how he brings history, a really deep engagement with history into his work. He also brings a deep engagement with students into his work, right? I mean, as college students, graduate students, and the high schoolers. His unpacking of these really sort of micro conversations among students is beautiful, and I think is a real model that none of us should think that we can or should do philosophy just by engaging with other philosophers. Second, and this has come up already in the first panel, his appreciation of the particular, right? So there is this, you know, philosophy of particularism, but there's also just his finding the profound in the small, such as the stiff-hipped dancers. And I should say, I found his appreciation of how the profound resides in the small also in the work of his daughter, Sarah Blum Smith. She wrote a paper in a class I taught 6 years ago on asking kids to be quiet and what the sort of ethical status is of that. It has sat with me for 6 years and is just, I think, an example of the way in which Larry has sort of passed his intellectual tendencies, the really, really wonderful intellectual tendencies to his children. He also appreciates the particular and really emphasizing internal distinctions that I think many, many people elide over. So some of his, like in his paper on charter schools, education, markets, and democracy, he distinguishes in very careful ways between those eligible for free lunch and reduced price lunch, and those who are identified as having intellectual intellectual disabilities versus, say, physical disabilities versus emotional and behavioral disabilities, and uses that to unpack, so how do we think about, say, charter schools in Boston? And he does this in ways like attending to the particularities on the ground make him a much, much more careful philosopher about, say, big level policy things. The third lesson I take from him is that one shouldn't be afraid to teach others. That, again, Larry does this in quiet ways, but really consistent ways. So he takes the plunge and he teaches in high school and not just in college. He teaches in South Africa and not only in the US. He teaches at Teachers College. He goes all over and he teaches through learning with others and through engaging with others, and he writes in ways that are accessible to others. And that's another way in which he is not afraid to teach others in a way that invites them in, as opposed to sort of setting up barriers. And then finally, the last and perhaps most profound lesson I take from Larry is that you should live as you learn, and you should learn as you live. Who Larry is in the world and his way of being in the world and his integration of the philosophical, the pedagogical, the ethical, the civic, and the personal, as Michaela discussed, I think is who Larry is, and it is a model for us to follow as we try to chart not only our own personal paths, but also our intellectual and professional paths. And I think the more we can integrate them to combine learning and living, I think the better off we'll be.
Well, I'm not sure what to say about the. I just have to think more about some of the things that you said, and some of the things you said. I never really thought of myself exactly as a philosopher of education. I don't have a traditional background in it, and sometimes I felt like, am I really a member of that particular sub profession? But I appreciate your including me and embracing me. I did also want to say that two of my children who are here are themselves both K through 12 teachers, and I think that my own involvement in the world of education has been very affected by their talking about their experiences over the years teaching in high school and elementary school. And I think that I kind of drifted into the field of education, and there have been a lot of different influences on my doing that, and I think that was an important part of it. This course at the high school that Meira talked about, I know many of you know about this, but maybe some of you don't. It was something that UMass supported me in taking time off from UMass, not totally time off, I still had to teach at UMass, but reducing my teaching load so that I could arrange with, it was my own local district, it's the school that Ben and Sarah went to allow me to teach, even though I had no background as a teacher at all. So I was very grateful to UMass as seeing that was a good thing to allow one of their faculty to do. I mean, there are people who teach at the secondary school level and kind of, come up to the academy from that, but there aren't that many who go from the academy into a high school class. And Meira's right that I learned just an unbelievable amount from the students in the 4 times that I taught that course. And I wanted to write that book partly because I thought it was so remarkable that these kids, and they were very racially and ethnically and economically as well diverse. There's tremendous diversity inside those classes, but they all basically rose to the challenge of very intellectually demanding material, but also incredibly personally charged material. And yet they were able to treat the class space as a place where they could engage with one another. And I thought it would be important for the general public, to the extent that they read this book, but that's part of who I was aiming for, to see that if 17-year-olds across racial lines can engage with each other about really heavy topics that adults should be better at it than they actually are. So I'll stop there. For either one of us.
What did Sarah say in the paper about telling kids to be quiet?
So I should say I have not reread the paper. What I remember her talking about was that Sarah's an elementary school teacher and talking about and you can correct me if you remember the paper, which you may well not. It's one of these required, first semester of your PhD papers, but that the way in which we ask kids to be quiet for good social reasons, that kids need quiet to learn, or at least many kids need quiet to learn, and that you need to create a community in which it is possible to learn. And at the same time, that when we ask kids to be quiet, we are both potentially positioning them as wrongdoers if they are not, and we are also neglecting the ways in which it's possible and often imperative to learn, this came up in the last panel, from one another, right, in a social way. And so how you integrate, how you think about the disciplinary and the pedagogical and kind of the civic and our moral relationships with one another in a classroom, and how you construct a classroom that enables the creation of a learning community while also honoring learning individuals in small groups, has an ethical valence. I don't know if that's at all right. Sure. Who knows, of some paper. That's what I remember of Sarah's paper. And I
think things about the sort of like reification of calm and quiet at the elementary level, and that there's sort of like some concerning ethical dimensions to that reification.
Sally Haslanger.
Thank you. Thank you for those who've organized this and for those who've come. So when Larry and I talked about what I was going to talk about, it was sort of, well, David's going to do the ethics, and Charles is going to do the race, and Meira's going to do the education. What are you going to talk about? And so we talked, threw around some things, and I said, well, I could talk about your approach, your method. And he said, well, I don't have a method. And so this is partly a kind of archaeological project of trying to sort of, having known Larry for a long time, sort of discern here something that is somewhat methodological, but not a method, if you know what I mean. Okay. So Larry is not, and I'm going to say many things that you've already heard before and just amplify and echo them. We didn't coordinate, so I didn't know that was going to be repetitive. So Larry is not just a professional philosopher. He's a philosopher through and through. His way of being in the world is philosophical. His way of being philosophical is personal, humane, and fully himself. The first time I read anything by Larry is when I was still an undergraduate at Reed College. I'd just become an avid feminist and was delighted to find a collection of papers on feminism and philosophy. That was the Gould and Bartosky Women in Philosophy. I immediately started a reading group and there encountered Larry's paper, Altruism and Women's Oppression, co-authored with Marcia Homiag, Judy Hausman, and Naomi Sheeman, who's here. Two of my dear friends, oh my God. Anyway, so an auspicious beginning to my philosophical feminism that I'm friends with two of those authors. I think I met Larry before I moved to Cambridge 20 years ago. I'm not sure. I don't quite remember. But since I've lived here, we've regularly spent time together, and he is a very dear friend. Importantly, we've been part of a reading group that meets every 3 weeks at either his house or my house. And my kids call this the Larry Group. The Larry Group, or what is more officially called the Moral Psychology Group, began in 1984, 35 years ago. In those early years, David Wong and Larry were the pillars of the group. When I joined in 1998, we alternated between Larry's house and David's, And then when David moved to Duke, my house became the second. Now, it's hard to describe the significance of this group. I'm sure I would not have become the philosopher I am today without it. My department at MIT is a typical elite, very white male, narrowly analytic department, and I don't fit well within it. My concerns are broader, my questions more political, my methodology more eclectic, my values more progressive. It's hard for me to have conversations about my work with my colleagues, and I often, almost always, feel marginalized. If I had to rely on the community of my colleagues for philosophical discussion, I don't think I would have had the stamina, the confidence, or the insight to walk the path I've taken. In the moral psych group over the last 20 years at least, the subject matter for discussion is not exclusively moral psychology. We read anything in moral, social, political theory that looks interesting. It's not always written by a philosopher, but our conversations are always philosophical. We've had stretches when we regularly read material from recent issues of ethics or philosophy and public affairs, and often ranted about them. We've gone back to read classic texts from the 60s and 70s to consider how moral philosophy has gotten where we are today. We've read articles in book chapters on neoliberalism, on race and racism, on philosophy and literature, and yes, on moral psychology, altruism, objectification, virtue, love, conscience, solidarity, autonomy, and forgiveness. What is distinctive about this group, in my view, is the commitment to read philosophy in relation to our current social conditions, with a shared understanding that philosophy should be offering us tools to understand it, to challenge it, and disrupt it. The members of the group are politically radical, though I'm not sure all of them would own up to that. I think that that's what we are. That we live in a deeply unjust society is never in question. That we should confront the injustice is never in question. That is taken absolutely for granted. But it is a question how and whether philosophy can inform and empower us in doing so. And I think we're never quite sure. I mean, maybe some of us are more sure than others, right? But there's always the question, what is this paper? What is this chapter? What is this book doing for us in our outrage? Well, that's me. I'm sorry. Not everyone is outraged. At the catastrophe, that we live in. Yeah, okay, so that's me. But there's an underlying thread that we live in a catastrophe. Now, Larry embodies the spirit of the group. Philosophy is to be done carefully with others and always with the actual and historical circumstances of immorality and injustice in mind. It is my understanding that this approach has been characteristic of Larry since he started doing philosophy at Princeton. As an undergraduate, he started as a math major, but turned to philosophy both because it was more engaged with the world than math, and because it provided tools for ethical thought. So drawing on the same interview that Michaela drew on, there's a quote here. He says of himself at the time, quote, "So I basically got into philosophy through ethics, and I became a complete fanatic. I just thought about ethics and ethical theory all the time," unquote. Then while Larry was in graduate school in the mid-60s at Harvard, the challenge became to fit together, that's his expression, the activist and the intellectual parts of his life. In a review of Larry's book, the one also that Michaela referenced about Simone Weil that he co-authored with Vic, Peter Winch says in a review of that book that Larry's chapters of the book are, quote, particularly useful in bringing out how intimately Simone Weil's own life and activities were married to her theoretical concerns. She was unusual in this and in most other things. And so Larry, I think, is also marrying the theoretical and the activist and the human being. I think this effort to integrate our humanity, our way of life with our theoretical, the integrating ourselves so that we live our values is true of everyone in the group. We're trying to live our values, aiming for this integration of our moral commitments and our passion for philosophy. But it's really not easy, right? And that's really hard. So why is it so hard? First, philosophy, especially moral philosophy, can be very abstract and focused on remote possibilities, trolley problems and such. You know, and oh my God, if we get a trolley problem in that group, it's like, oh my God, why are we doing this? Okay, now there is, of course, I mean, I live in a department where trolley problems are like, oh, all the time we talk about trolley problems. They talk about trolley problems. Anyway, there is, of course, a point to such abstraction. If we're trying to understand the nature of moral responsibility, it can be useful to do controlled thought experiments. For example, we might inquire into what triggers judgments of responsibility by keeping a substantial set of factors constant across a variety of imagined scenarios, and see how our moral judgments vary with the remaining factors. Like, you know, that's controlled experiments. They do that in the sciences. We do it in philosophy. Some people do it in philosophy. But the abstractness of such reflection occludes many of the factors that might be relevant. For example, our relationship with the agents, the history leading up to the circumstances, the cultural influences on our judgments, the relevance of emotions in discerning moral facts. And you don't have emotions with abstract, let there be X and let there be Y, who are throwing people off the bridge to stop the trolley, right? That's very hard to have emotional reactions to them. Ignoring these factors can, of course, distort the results. And this is something that Larry has explored in detail in two of his books, Friendship, Altruism, and Morality, 1980, and The Moral Perception and Moral Particularity in 1994. And in response to a certain Kantian trend to identify the moral realm as one governed by duty and impartiality, Larry argues that personal relationships, such as friendships, require a kind of emotional responsiveness to the other, including compassion, altruism, and sympathy, that is deeply moral but is not impartial and is not aptly understood in terms of duty. More generally, immediate concern for the weal and woe of others is essential to morality. Now, these points are very commonplace at this point, but we should remember that Gilligan published in a different voice in 1982. So Larry was writing about this in his dissertation. He was also published Friendship, Altruism, and Morality in 1980. So they were really groundbreaking at the time. According to one reviewer, Larry's first book was hailed in the Sunday Times as marking a revolution in moral philosophy. I tried to find the review, but MIT only gets access to the Sunday Times as of like 1983 or something like that, and so I couldn't get I wanted to read more, but this is a quote from it. So more generally, in this work, Larry urges us to step back from the theoretical impulse to search for foundations of morality and to explore the richness of our moral sentiments and judgments. There's an important difference between doing moral theory as a response to philosophical puzzles and doing moral theory as an effort to understand ordinary moral experience, drawing, of course, on the experience of non-philosophers. We can allow that both approaches have their value. See, I live in a department. I can't go around saying, that stuff is bullshit. Even, my husband, I live with someone who spends his life worrying about philosophical puzzles. Right? I get it, sort of. Life is finite. If life weren't finite, I'd spend some time doing that too. But life is finite. Okay, Sally, this is what happens. But for Larry and others in the moral psych group, the drive to use philosophy as a resource for living an integrated life favors attention to moral experience over moral puzzles. So Larry's approach to the question of moral philosophy tends to be more introspective, even phenomenological than mine. That's not how I do it, but he does it. He's brilliant at reflecting on a concept or an idea and pulling apart a variety of threads that have been woven together. He asks profound questions about the application of concepts to hard cases and always finds every resource available in an author's work to make progress on a problem. His work on Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch are excellent examples. Both clearly exemplify a rich moral sensibility. Weil and Murdoch have an incredibly rich sensibility, but don't write in standard philosophical prose. Instead, they offer a window into moral life that requires more than cleverness to see through. One must allow oneself to enter into their worlds. So, for example, I want to read a quote from one of Larry's pieces. This is a longish quote, but I love it because it also shows Larry as a teacher, right? It's that integration that's so wonderful. So this is in Moral Particularity and that one. Anyway, so he says, Murdoch's view is not concerned with weighing up benefits and losses. It is, in fact, not concerned with the agent's own benefit at all. It bids us to focus on others not at the expense of the self, but so to speak, without considering the self at all. The moral task is not self-negation, but self-transcending. In many cases of acting for the sake of another, it could not be meaningfully said whether the agent had lost more than the other had gained or not. So no cost-benefit. If, for example, I stay an extra hour in my office to help a student to whom I've already devoted a fair amount of time, but whom I want to help, I'm not necessarily giving up potential benefit, which is either more or less than what the student will gain. In fact, in some cases, to weigh the benefits and losses, even if one ends up giving more than the other gains, might be token a failure of the focus on the other that Murdoch wants from us. Okay, so there's a kind of both a sense of his articulating a part of Murdoch that Murdoch doesn't say anywhere nearly as clearly. I mean, I could have tried to give you the quotes from Murdoch and show how Larry is brilliant in his interpreter of text to make them philosophical. But this is also just a hard thought, and it's a hard thought that clearly is guiding his life, guiding his relationship with students, and explicating that in beautiful terms. So I think that Larry's carefulness in all matters deserves the term carefulness because it's a form of caring. He cares about the world, about the disenfranchised, about ideas and their authors, about students and colleagues, about moral sensibilities and moral life. And that is a fundamental source of his integration, of one form of his integration. Like me, not so much, right? I don't care about I'm not a good carer, all right? Larry, oh my God, he cares. He cares so much about people and about ideas. Me, I get too impatient, as you can tell. I get like frustrated and angry. Anger is kind of my integrating thing. Anyway, you're not here to learn about me. You're here to learn about Larry. So a second feature of philosophy that makes it difficult to integrate into a life is something Charles brought up, its concern with the ideal. What is right action? What is moral worth? What is justice? But life as we know it is full of wrong action, immorality, injustice. We are implicated in justice, whether we like it or not, and we struggle to know how to respond to wrongdoing and avoid it in ourselves. It often seems that the lofty ideals that philosophers discuss are irrelevant to our daily concerns. I think that's true. It's not what I need. I'm sorry. I'm too upset about the immediate wrong that's occurring right here to worry about what justice would be under ideal conditions. In the non-ideal world, context is everything. I've already mentioned Larry's interest in personal relationships and human psychology, but context also includes history, socioeconomic conditions, and state institutions. One way to engage in non-ideal moral theory is to begin with the problems and struggles before us. Larry's work on race and on education are wonderful examples. Our day-to-day challenge is how to live within a system of racial oppression, how to live with it, be part of it, enact it, refuse it, and sometimes small ways change it. The answer does not come from our a priori reflection. It doesn't come from ideal theory. It comes from understanding the history of racial oppression, which Larry talks about and beautifully in I'm Not a Racist But, and the possibility for actual intervention, which is developed in the high school book. These are just the published output. Of course, we could go on at length about all that Larry does in addition to write philosophy papers. I mean, and the life he lives is informed by philosophy, and his personal life is integrated in all of that as well. So race and class relations are not for him a topic of sociology or political philosophy. They're parts of everyday life. And a moral response to race relations must grapple with that reality and must be lived and not just thought. So I mentioned before that an important feature of Larry's approach is his interest in the richness and complexity of our moral concepts. And a lot of his work draws on his tremendous sensitivity and morally fraught situations. But under conditions of injustice, we cannot simply trust our moral responses. So this is where part of my worry is that there are moments when Larry seems to be doing much more of a descriptivist approach to to moral philosophy, where, oh, if you just have, a good enough capacity to describe our moral concepts and distinguish them and things like that, then they're going to carry normative force. But I myself, I do ideology critique, right? I think it's all deeply ideologically informed. And so I'm struggling with this, going, oh my God, how can you trust your impulses, your conceptual framework? How can you trust it? It's all been framed in terms of, centuries and centuries of white supremacy and male supremacy and all of this. I find that really hard. All right, okay. Under conditions of injustice, we can't simply trust our moral responsive, and a descriptive moral theory, I think, can't be sufficient. But neither can we just invoke a priori ideals, like they're tainted too. They're just as ideological. So how do we proceed? This is a guess. This is one of those archaeological moments where I'm trying to figure out how he proceeds. Because of course, I learn so much from him all the time. Larry's approach, as I understand it, is to put himself with others into situations calling for insight, understanding, and change, and to think and feel together. This can happen at a conference, in a reading group, but more importantly, in a classroom, whether it be a high school or UMass, in activist organizing, even in an encounter on the street. On this approach to moral knowledge, we learn with others in real time. We recognize the tools we have to understand the moral shape of our interactions are not sufficient. We let ourselves be open and vulnerable, and we pay attention, and we don't come out of it unchanged. Philosophical knowledge is not separate, in this view, from practical knowledge. You learn how to be an agent with others. You learn how to engage with others, where that's not, maybe that's connected to the David Wong idea, that morality is part of a set of relationships, and those relationships have the potential for change. Many of those relationships are screwed up, right? And so you can't take all of those encounters to be revelatory, but you can find some of them to be revelatory. I've seen this approach in Larry's participation in the reading group. I've also seen it in his teaching and speaking. When Larry taught at CRLS and preparing for writing the high school book, he brought me in to be part of an evaluation process. I watched him interact with the students, their engagement with him, their excitement and curiosity. They were empowered. They had so much to offer and knew that they would be granted credibility, respect, and full epistemic standing. And to talk to Larry afterwards about their contributions and his deep appreciation of where they were coming from and how they were struggling with the issues, what insights they offered, all of that was a lesson to me, not just in pedagogy, but in how to do philosophy, how to gain philosophical and moral knowledge. You gain it, and this is connected to some of Meira's points, you gain it in teaching. You gain it in teaching people who are very different from you. You gain it at the cash register, for God's sakes, right? Well, I mean, that's maybe the bad example because I'm an anti-capitalist. But anyway, you gain it in your everyday, like dealing with life, with people. So not everyone does philosophy in a way that is easily integrated in a life. Some of what is beautiful about philosophy is its abstractness, the possibility of leaving the messiness of this life behind to contemplate idealized models of complicated phenomena. But some of us just can't do that. The demands on our sensibilities, our judgments, our actions are too immediate, and just muddling along is painful. We want help from philosophy. We cannot turn it off, but we can't do it in the way that is typically validated. A group of us have the good fortune of knowing Larry and so have a model of living a philosophically informed life. I articulated the model roughly above. Philosophy is to be done carefully with others and always with the actual and historical circumstances of immorality and injustice in mind. Better, philosophy is not just to be thought, but to be lived. Larry's written work has inspired me, but more importantly, the conversations, the disagreements, the dawning insights, the collective process of encountering together the challenges of life and thought have given me a way to be in the world and the strength to model this way in turn to others. For this and so much more, Larry, I'm forever grateful.